Hello. Hi, Kritan. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, I've got a bit of a problem. My house internet is down, so I'm using my phone internet. So it might yeah, I haven't tried it. I think the phone internet's quite good, but yeah, fingers crossed. Let me just go and grab a glass of water. Yeah, how are you? Okay. Okay. So I guess I might as well get started. Um, Normally, I just wait a little bit to get started, to wait. Hopefully, there'll be a few more people coming. Um, but um, because I have another class immediately after this one, we can't sort of go over. So let me get started. And then I wanted to ask at the end of class about what your preferences were for what to do with Nietzsche. So I think next week is the last week before the spring break, yeah. But we sort of missed a week because of the delay in the beginning of the semester, so we're a little bit behind. We could just finish Nietzsche before spring break and then just start with Russell and Wittgenstein afterwards, or we could do another week of Nietzsche after spring break and then start, maybe skip the Russell, jump straight into the Wittgenstein. Then maybe we could add an extra session on at the end to make up for the lost time. But anyway, at the end of class today, I'll talk about it, and then I'll basically just kind of, I think the students who are coming regularly, there aren't that many of you, so you guys, can give me your preferences and we can decide how to go. So today I want to finish off book one, or essay one, and we're going to look at book 113, which I think is one of the most. If you have you read it? Have any of you managed to find time to read it since last class? It's only a couple of pages, and I think it's one of the kind of more influential bits of Nietzsche. One of the things going on here is he sort of attacks the idea of freedom of the will. And I think one of the kind of things about Nietzsche is, in terms of his sort of politics, I think in many ways he's sort of anti-democratic or anti the herd. He's sort of got views that we might consider to be quite on the right. On the other hand, though, I think his views on freedom and his views on retribution are in some sense, or at least traditionally, kind of on the more progressive side. So that Nietzsche, I think, is in some sense thinks that the idea of sort of blame and retribution are sort of first of all, they're based on a kind of falsity, yeah, because they presuppose, I think, freedom, which he thinks is a sort of myth. So they're based on falsity. Now, of course, I think for Nietzsche, showing that something is false doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. Because in some sense, maybe all of our sort of values are constructed. Maybe they're all, in some sense, false and created. Yeah. And so the fact that the idea of freedom is a sort of error doesn't necessarily mean that for Nietzsche that it's something we should reject, because it may turn out that it's a sort of healthy error. So I think Nietzsche's got this kind of two-pronged attack on the idea of responsibility, that he thinks that it's based on a sort of error and falsity, but that in itself is not a reason to necessarily reject it, because in some sense maybe we just need myths to live by. Yeah, but I take it he thinks that it's also unhealthy. Yeah. And that in a sort of healthy society, or a healthier society is going to be less retributive. It's going to be less into blame and punishment. So in book 2, the focus moves to punishment and the idea of responsibility. And I think one of the themes there is that punishment is a sort of expression of weakness. Yeah, the stronger the society is, the less need it has to punish. The stronger the individual is, the less need they have to seek revenge or to punish the wrongdoer. Yeah, the sort of drive to punish and to blame is a sort of an expression of weakness and impotence. Yeah, and as one's power increases, and I think as one's health increases, we have less need to engage in practices of blame and holding people responsible. So I do think, once again, there are these questions about how to read Nietzsche, and to think, has he actually got any commitments, or is he just like, is he just into play and suspending judgment? And I tend to think that no, Nietzsche does have a sort of bunch of commitments, a bunch of values that are implicit in his works, I think remain fairly fixed. There are certain fixed sort of values and commitments that we find right the way kind of from Human All Too Human to the genealogy. And I think one of them is this sort of negative attitude towards things like blame, holding responsible, and in a certain sense, punishment. Yeah. Okay. So let's look at number 13, and then if we have time, we can jump into essay 2. And essay 2 is sort of relevant because essay 2 starts with the idea of responsibility. So I think there's a sort of natural segue from this passage, this discussion here, to the discussion in the second essay. So let me I'm just going to share the screen. Yeah, because my internet was down, I didn't upload the link and the files from last class to the Dropbox, but I'll do that. Yeah, so this is in the passage where he's talking about the slave revolt. The slave revolt has its origin in Resentiment, and I take it that he also thinks that our sort of commitment to freedom of will. I think there are two stories he tells, and it's not clear how these stories relate to one another. So there's one sort of story which seems to suggest that the belief of freedom is based upon a sort of cognitive mistake. So one of the arguments he gives is that we're seduced by grammar. Yeah. On the other hand, though, the main thrust of this passage is the idea that that of this section is the idea that this belief in freedom goes together with ressentiment, yeah, and is a sort of expression of the impotence and the sort of anger and the resentment of those who are undertrodden. So I take it the sort of story is that this belief in free will is driven by this feeling of hatred, of ressentiment, and there's a sort of the positing freedom of the will is Nietzsche thinks is a type of revenge, but it's a type of revenge that is made possible by the way our grammar works. So the seduction by grammar is we're in our anger, we're sort of seduced by the grammar. If we were kind of calm and collected, that we'd be able to kind of pass by the grammar and maybe not fall for it. And I think this idea of being seduced by grammar. So in the last sessions, I was trying to make these sort of connections between Mill and Nietzsche. I think here there's a sort of connection, as we'll maybe see, between Russell and Nietzsche. Yeah. And so kind of part of Russell's story in On Denoting is that we're seduced by the surface grammar of sentences, yeah, and we are sort of misled by the surface grammar of things. So we have these sentences where we have expressions that take up what seems to be the subject role in a sentence. So like the King of France is bald. And because it functions grammatically as a subject, yeah, on the surface, we take it then that the expression "the King of France" must be something like a name, yeah. And Russell, kind of his famous argument is On Denoting, is I think in some sense suggesting that we're sort of seduced by grammar, and we have to get beyond the grammar. And Russell's way of sort of and I think the early analytic tradition's way of sort of not being seduced by grammar involved doing logic. So we get rid of our natural language, and we try and convert everything into this regimented language of an ideal language. Yeah, the language of Russell's new logic, classical logic. But I think Nietzsche I think thinks maybe we can do it through genealogy. Yeah, that if we can come to understand the ways in which we're seduced by grammar by sort of uncovering the history. So I think Nietzsche and Russell both posit the idea of being seduced by grammar, but they have very different ways of thinking what to do about it. I mean, I think as I suggested before, Nietzsche thinks that, you know, maybe grammar is just really hot. You know, hooking up with grammar may just be fun. Yeah. So being seduced by grammar, sometimes, you know, you're going to have a good time. And if it's good enough, why not do it? So the problem about being seduced by grammar is when grammar is sort of a bit ugly and a bit nasty. And isn't good for you. You catch some nasty disease from grammar, you know, or yeah, I think this is sort of Nietzsche's sort of take. So this section, he starts off by appealing to the idea of ressentiment, and he suggests that we can think of the aristocrats as great birds of prey, and those who are impotent like sheep, or lambs. And he says that lambs dislike great birds of prey. It does not seem strange. Yeah. Only it gives no grounds for reproaching these birds of prey for bearing off little lambs. You know, so of course the lambs are not going to like the eagles, but the kind of we can't. Yeah, we're not going to blame the eagles for eating the lambs. And if the lambs say amongst themselves, these birds of prey are evil, and whoever is least like a bird of prey, but rather its opposite a lamb, would he not be good? There is no reason to find fault with this institution of an ideal. Yeah, so once again, we can't blame the eagle for eating the lambs. In some sense, we can't blame the lambs for hating the eagles. Except the birds of prey might find it quite funny. like there is no reason to find fault with this institution of an ideal. So, that the lamb's set of values, I think once again, Nietzsche doesn't think that the fact that they're sort of projected and based upon the perspective and the interests of the lambs mean that we should reject them. Yeah. So the fact that slave morality has its roots in resentiment and hatred of the oppressor Nietzsche doesn't think that in itself is a reason to find fault with it, but it may give us some reason to sort of parody it and find it ironic. Yeah, so he says perhaps the birds of prey might view it a little ironically and say, we don't like them at all, these good little lambs. We even love them. Nothing is more tasty than a tender lamb. Yeah, so the lambs hate the birds of prey, and the birds of prey like, well, we really like lambs. Like, we're really happy they're around. We love lambs. Yeah, we're big fans of lambs. We don't understand why they don't like us. Now, this sort of practice of sort of kind of blaming the birds of prey, the oppressors, and then thinking whatever is least like a bird of prey is good. I mean, this sort of finding fault with the birds of prey, Nietzsche thinks is to suggest that it's to demand of strength that it not express itself of strength, that it should not be a desire to overcome, a desire to throw down, a desire to become master. Yeah. It's just as it is absurd to demand of weakness that it should express itself as strength. So it's in some sense absurd, Nietzsche thinks, to blame the birds of prey for eating the lambs and for having a value system. If the birds of prey had a value system, they're going to value each other in terms of, oh, he's good at catching lambs. Yeah. But I think he thinks that it's just as absurd to demand of weakness that should it express itself as strength. So the sort of reaction of the lambs, which is this sort of resentiment that gives rise to its own sort of value system. I think it's also absurd to kind of, in some sense, reject this, or to blame the lambs. Now, one of the things when Nietzsche, in his final years, he was working on a sort of big book in which he was never finished, called The Will to Power, provisionally called The Will to Power. And this book was sort of, in some sense, hashed together after he died by his sister, his proto-Nazi sister and her husband. And so it's very difficult to know exactly what his view would look like. But this idea of the will to power is an idea that becomes quite central in the later Nietzsche. And I think this notion of will to power is doing quite a lot of work here. So we have this idea that human beings can be thought of as some sense as sort of collections of drives. And these drives, each one has its own will to power. And that our actions are a result of these sort of drives within us, competing with each other, overpowering one another, and giving expression to our behavior. Yeah, so he's got a view about human action. But I think one of the things that's interesting about Nietzsche, I think, is his sort of views about psychology. And I think his view about psychology involves a sort of rejection of a sort of unified self. The self itself is multiple. Emerson, who I think I think Emerson or Whitman, who said, "I contain multitudes," which is an idea I think that maybe they're getting from Nietzsche. And so he thinks that that human beings could be thought of as these sort of collections of internal forces. Yeah. And it's only because of the seduction of language. Yeah. And so this is the seduction of language passage. He says it's only owing to the seduction of language and of the fundamental errors of reason that are petrified in it, which conceives and misconceives all effects as conditioned by something that causes effects, by a subject, can it appear otherwise. So grammatically, whenever you've got a predicate, you need a subject. Whenever you've got a verb, you need a noun, you need a subject of the noun. So our languages work in such a way that all actions require an actor. Yeah, whenever there's an action, there's got to be an agent. And this sort of principle that all actions require an agent is a sort of principle of grammar. It's a grammatical principle. And Nietzsche thinks it's a grammatical principle that in some sense has the sort of petrified errors of reason within it. Yeah. I think this sort of claim, I think is quite Kantian. If you've read the Critique of Pure Reason, the second half, the Transcendental Dialectic, this has got to do with reason's sort of unstoppable striving for what Kant calls the unconditioned. So and whenever we kind of, and part of this is that whenever we have a predicate, we need a subject. There needs to be some subject of inherence, yeah, and that there needs to be some absolute subject. It can't. It's a principle of reason that it can't be sort of processes and actions all the way down. There's got to be something that does this stuff. But this Kant thinks is what he calls a dialectical principle of reason. It's a sort of it's a principle that is perfectly fine as a logical principle. Whenever you find an action, look for its subject. But we sort of petrify it, Kant thinks, into a sort of metaphysical thing that thinks that all change presupposes some sort of subject of change, some sort of substance. All actions require an agent. So I think Nietzsche here has got a kind of quite Kantian idea in the background that we're seduced by language, and in language, all predicates require a subject, all actions require an agent. Yeah. Now, and he thinks that the reason our language is like this is because of these fundamental errors of reason that are sort of reified into our language. And I take it that these sort of fundamental errors maybe are something like this Kantian account of what Kant calls transcendental illusion, that we have this striving for what Kant calls the unconditioned. And I think that Nietzsche here is sort of proposing, I think in terms of his fundamental ontology, I think maybe Nietzsche is ultimately committed to some form of what we might think of as process ontology. So according to the sort of process ontologists, it's sort of processes all the way down. So the process ontologists reject the idea of ultimate substances. This sort of process on something a bit like process ontology you find amongst some people in the philosophy of science who call themselves structural realists. So they're ultimately there are just relations, and the substance metaphysicians say no. In order for there to be relations, there need to be things related. You can't have relations without relata. Yeah, and so the fundamental building blocks of the universe have to be the substances. And I think Nietzsche, like Kant, thinks this is a sort of mistake. And he has a quite nice illustration of this. So he says, for just as the popular mind separates the lightning from its flash and takes the latter for an action for the operation of a subject called lightning. So how do you say it in Turkish? Do you say şimşek şimiyor? Yeah, the lightning the lightning flashes, we'd say in England. Yeah, there we have a sort of subject.
Çaktı deriz herhalde.
How would you say it?
Şimşek çaktı, çakmak.
Şimşek çakıyor. Yeah, so you've got two things. You've got the lightning, and then you've got its action. Yeah, in English we'll say the lightning flashes. I guess it's the same sort of thing. And I guess, see, that there you sort of, Nietzsche thinks that this is an example. Like, all there really is the process, the lightning. The lightning is its flash. It's not like two things. It's not like you've got the lightning behind its flash. Yeah, so in the case of lightning, that grammatically we're seduced into positing two things, the lightning and its flash. And I think kind of when we're thinking about it, we sort of do think about it in this way. We can't really help it. But Nietzsche thinks that when we think about lightning, we come to see quite quickly that this way of thinking is a sort of mistake. And given the way that we're mistaken about lightning, he wants to say that we're similarly mistaken when we think the kind of subject acts. I do something, and we assume that there's two things, the I and the action. And Nietzsche, I think, thinks that when it comes to individuals, that all there really is are the activities of the individual, that the individual is constituted by his or her activity. That's all an individual is. It's a collection of, an individual is a sort of collection, an organized, structured collection of processes, is how we might think about it. And I think this way of thinking about things, there's been a sort of growing resurgence of sort of process ontologies within the analytic tradition. And it seems to me like if you look at biological systems, it's quite clear that biological systems are really structured collections of processes. Yeah, what it is to be alive involves metabolism, and no metabolism, no life. And metabolism, what it is to metabolism is to have these ongoing interactions between the organism and the environment. Eating and shitting, taking in nutrition. And this is something you get at the level of the cell, at the level of the organ, at the level of the whole organism. Yeah, so he says, just as the popular mind separates the lightning from its flash and takes the latter, the flash, for an action for the operation of a subject called lightning, so popular morality also separates strength from the expression of strength. It separates human activity from the agent, as if there are a neutral substratum behind the strong man. Yeah, so you've got the individual's action, and then you've got this neutral substratum, the agent who acts, which was free to express strength or not to do so. But there is no such substratum. There is no being behind doing. And so I think this, being we might think of as the name of what we think substance is. Yeah, there's no being behind doing. There's no substance behind the processes. There's no being behind doing, affecting, becoming. Yeah, the fundamental ontology is one of becoming, not one of being. There's a sort of, I think, an attempt to sort of reclaim, he's a classic scholar, so I think he wants to kind of reclaim something more Heraclitan. Yeah, this is a sort of metaphysics of Heraclitus. The doer is merely a fiction added to the deed. The deed is everything. Yeah. Now, as I said before, that the fact that it's a fiction in and of itself should not be problematic, I think, because I think you can think that the kind of self, the I, is somehow constructed. But once it's been constructed, in some sense, maybe it becomes real as a fiction. Yeah. So merely to say that the idea of the agent is a sort of fiction, it seems to me, even from Nietzsche's own perspective, is it? Because then we might ask ourselves: is it a useful fiction? Is it a helpful fiction? Is it? Yeah. Anyway, the popular mind, in fact, doubles the deed. When it sees the lightning flash, it is the deed of a deed. It posits the same event, first of cause, and then second time as effect. Yeah. So, and he says scientists do no better when they say force moves. You've got two things: the force and the activity. And the sort of thought is, I think Nietzsche has is no, all there really is the activity. Yeah, forces, cause, and the like. Yeah, all of its coolness, its freedom from a notion, what notwithstanding, our entire science still lies under the misleading influence of language and has not disposed of that little changeling, the subject. Yeah, the atom, for example, the Kantian thing in itself. Now, it seems to me that in my other class at the moment, I'm teaching Kant's paralogisms, which is the chapter of the dialectic that are about Kant's views of the subject. And I think Kant is a bit closer to Nietzsche in certain ways than he thinks, because the idea of the thing in itself, I take it for Kant, is a sort of construct. Yeah, we don't have any cognition of it. And they say so it's no wonder if the submerged, darkly glowing emotions of vengefulness and hatred exploit this belief. So the idea is we have this sort of, we're seduced by grammar, and then this seduction by grammar to posit a subject for every predicate, to believe in substances, to believe in, for every action there's an agent. This is sort of exploited by the sort of, and I take it that it's exploited by this sort of drive for vengeance. I take it Nietzsche's got this idea that individuals are sort of collections of drives, and drives themselves have a sort of have goals. Yeah, they desire to overpower and to control. And so these sort of emotions, it's not the agent who exploits this fact about language, but it's the sort of emotions that exploit this fact about grammar, yeah, for their own ends. So we've got the emotions of vengefulness and hatred exploit this belief for their own ends. Yeah, I think he does. I mean, we might just think this is rhetoric, yeah, but I think he does think that it's that these emotions and drive have sort of ends, have goals, have interests, and are the sort of driving force in the sort of construction of narratives and values. And in fact, maintain no belief more ardently than the belief that the strong man is free to be weak and the bird of prey to be a lamb. Yeah, and thus they gain the right to make the bird of prey accountable for being a bird of prey. So that by positing this distinction between the doer and the deed, this then allows this sort of vengefulness, this drive for vengefulness, to make the bird of prey accountable for their nature. Yeah, and this is one of the things that is going to be at the heart of this Christian ethics of blame. Yeah. So yeah, so this the final paragraph here, there's yeah, and so it allows the weak to hold the strong accountable, but it also allows the weak, the oppressed, to, in some sense, symbolically overcome their oppression. Because if the strong is free to be weak, this means also the weak is free to be strong, but has freely chosen to be weak. And so in some sense, this is a way of sort of symbolically overcoming oppression. Because in some sense, the weak can say, oh, I freely chose to do this because it's the right thing to do. Yeah. So it's a way of, in some sense, denying one's own impotence. No, I'm not impotent. I don't lack power. I've freely chosen to kiss the hand. that out of my goodness. Yeah. And so by the idea of freedom has a sort of two sides to it. In holding other, and Nietzsche thinks both of these sides are driven by emotional needs of the impotent. First of all, the need to kind of find the oppressor accountable and blameworthy. But secondly, it allows the impotent to feel themselves that they're not impotent, because they can think that they've freely chosen their sort of being. Yeah, so I'm just wondering. The problem with Nietzsche, some of his sentences are so long. I've got the bits I want to kind of stress marked, but then it's like, where do I start? Because in order to understand the particular bit of the sentence, it's like, oh, I've got to go back right to the beginning of the paragraph. So he says, yeah, so, you know, the weak, yeah, so we've got the prudence of the lowest order that even insects possess. So, you know, you can pose as dead when in great danger. Has thanks to the counterfeit and self-deception of impotence, clad itself in the ostentatious garb of the virtue of quiet, calm resignation. Yeah, so rather than interpreting their own behavior as lack of power, they can interpret their actions, their weakness, as the virtue of quiet, calm resignation. Just as if the weakness of the weak, that is to say their essence, their effects, their soul, ineluctable, irremovable reality, were a voluntarily achieved, willed, chosen, a deed, a meritorious act. Yeah. So this type of man needs to believe in a neutral, independent subject promoted by an instinct of self-preservation and self-affirmation. I think this is interesting because we started off with the idea that this belief in freedom is driven by hatred. Yeah. But here we get the idea that it's sort of driven by an instinct of self-preservation and self-affirmation. Yeah. It's driven maybe by will to power. It's a self-interpretation that allows one to live in a meaningful way. Yeah. So once again, that with Nietzsche, that you have to be quite careful because the tone, he quite often radically changes his tone. Yeah, to try in a way that really is aimed at, I think, confusing you and destabilizing the reader. Yeah. So on the one hand, this is a fiction, but on the other hand, it's a fiction that is promoted by an instinct for self-preservation and self-affirmation, in which every lie is sanctified. So that the drive for self-affirmation, there are some fictions, some lies that are sanctified. And the topic of the third essay on ideals, he says, and ideals of self-denial. He talks about the ideals of self-denial. He talks about artist self-denial. But I think the main topic is the way in which the ideals of the scientist, the scholar, and the philosopher involves self-denial. And in particular, he thinks that the will to truth ultimately may be another sort of exemplification of this will to self-denial. And so self-affirmation involves fictions, yeah, and lies, yeah, when we're talking about lies and fiction, we're talking, and the tension here, we're talking about the kind of the artist. It's the artist who creates fictions. Yeah. So the oppressed here, in kind of coming up with this idea of the independent subject, on the one hand, it's sort of cowardly and weak, but on the other hand, it's a kind of artistic expression of self-affirmation. Yeah. So he says the subject, or to use a more popular expression, the soul, has been believed in hitherto more firmly than anything else on earth, because it makes possible to the majority of mortals, the weak and oppressed of every kind, the sublime self-deception that interprets weakness of freedom, and their being thus and thus as merit. Now, once again, here we get the this is the kind of the ideology of the herd. Nietzsche kind of has a lot of kind of anti-herd rhetoric. You know, the common man, not the higher type. But I think once again, his attitude and the attitude of the reader, I think he sort of plays with various tones, some of which are quite negative and some of which are quite affirmative. Yeah. And so what are we to make of this when we're interpreting Nietzsche? But I think this is one of my favorite sections in the first book of the genealogy. It's now kind of, yeah, we've got another kind of 8 minutes or so. So any thoughts about this, questions, ideas? Yeah, I think once again, like the aesthetic side here, fiction is a type of art, that we've got this self-deception is sublime. It's a sort of breathtaking, yeah, creative act of wonder. Yes, I think there's quite a lot of people today who take the sort of subject as a sort of fiction, but without thinking of this in a sort of negative sense. It's a sort of construct. It's a goal. If you think of Freud, we might think that being a subject is rather than a starting point, is a sort of achievement. Yeah. So the whole point of ego psychology is to become an I. Yeah. And I think that Kant's views are sort of like this: that the I, the sort of unified agent, isn't the arche. It's not the starting point. It's in some sense like the telos of, yeah, we've got all this mess inside, all these competing drives, and then the sort of Kantian moral agent kind of strives to unify these drives. And I think as a Nietzschean, you might think, well, and what you want to do is to create a sort of a beautiful subject. Yeah, I think Nietzsche has got this. I think some of the post-Kantians, the sort of romantics, had the idea, took these Kantian ideas and then gave them this sort of aesthetic spin. And I think that some of the things that Nietzsche says might be connected with this. So let's finish the first essay, and then let's jump into essay 2. And I mentioned something. So essay 2 is about the origin of. So this is starting on page 57. Yeah. So essay 2 is on guilt, bad conscience, and the like. And the story here is that the feeling of guilt is understood as a certain type of pain, a sort of, and maybe the sort of pain that's caused by living in societies where we can't live freely and act on all of our aggressive and sexual drives. So we've been sort of domesticated, and we have these drives that can't be expressed, and this causes a certain sort of pain. I think that we also have other types of pain, that isn't a result of repression. And one sort of question is, and I take it Nietzsche's sort of thought is that guilt is this psychic pain that's sort of interpreted as punishment. And so in order for this story to be plausible, it has to be the case that the practice of punishment emerged prior to the feeling of guilt, or the concept of guilt. And I think this, for many people in the 19th century, this may seem paradoxical, because we might think, well, we use punishment to punish the guilty. And so the notion of guilt has to, in some sense, be prior to punishment. And Nietzsche wants to give an account of punishment that, in some sense, is a sort of demoralized version of punishment that then is taken up within a certain set of values as a way of interpreting one's own sort of inner psychic anguish. So that's the main sort of thrust. And I think he's got some interesting things to say about punishment. One thing, though, in the first two sections, he talks about this idea of breeding an animal with the right to make promises. And human beings, one of the things that human beings can do is that we can sort of make commitments. And I think Nietzsche thinks that this is something that is a good thing. That we are able to kind of because this is what, in some sense, having a will to power, insofar as we can make commitments, this is something that sort of strengthens our faculties and our powers. And I take it that sorry, I've lost Nietzsche. I mean, to a degree, that the sort of action man, the noble, is not very good at this sort of thing. So this is something that I mean, I think so. One sort of question is to what degree are the nobles in this class? And so in section 1 and 2, he talks about, he's got some interesting stuff about memory. I'm not going to focus much on it. But on page 59 in section 2, he introduces this idea of what he calls the sovereign individual. And so I think one thing that's kind of a big question amongst Nietzsche scholars is exactly what is this sovereign individual doing in Nietzsche's in the genealogy? Because he mentions the sovereign individual, but we don't really sorry, this is the wrong page. Here, sorry. So this is on page 59. And of course, this idea of the sovereign individual, we might think of as in some sense, something like Nietzsche's version of being autonomous. So once again, I think there is and so it looks like this idea of being a sovereign individual is something that kind of emerges prior to the idea of guilt and bad conscience, involves something more than, and is something that I think Nietzsche is part of Nietzsche's sort of ideal. There's something kind of Nietzsche's sort of, in terms of Nietzsche's values, this idea of the sovereign individual is something that he's got a positive attitude towards. So I'm just going to read this, and I'm just going to leave it because it's not clear how this fits in. So he says, if we place ourselves at the end of this tremendous process, where the tree at last brings forth fruit, where society and the morality of custom at last reveal what they have simply been the means to, then we discover the righteous fruit is the sovereign individual. Like only from him to himself, liberated again from morality of custom, autonomous and supramoral. Yeah, so we've got this sovereign individual who is liberated from morality and autonomous. Yeah. And of course, there's a sort of engagement with Kant here. So he says, for autonomous and moral are mutually exclusive. Yeah, either you're autonomous or you're moral. Yeah. At least understood in terms of this morality of custom. In short, the man who has his own independent protracted will and the right to make promises. So a protracted will, this is a person who's able to kind of will across time. Yeah, who's able to make a decision to do something tomorrow and stick to it. Yeah, in order to make commitments. Yeah, so in some sense, this is an incredible increase in power, and involves a certain type of autonomy. Yeah, but Nietzsche, unlike Kant, wants to separate autonomy from morality. And in him, a proud consciousness quivering in every muscle of what has at length been achieved and become flesh in him, a consciousness of his own power and freedom, a sensation of mankind come to completion. This emancipated individual with the actual right to make promises, this master of free will, this sovereign man, how should he not be aware of his superiority over all these who lack the right to make promises and stand as their own guarantees? Yeah, so I take it that I think this idea of the sovereign individual that he introduces here and in this next section, I mean, I think he thinks that this is something that emerges with society. Yeah. And the sovereign individual is someone who's kind of got the benefits of society without the kind of bad Christian guilt stuff. Yeah. Now, it seems to me that the sort of noble, if we push the idea of the noble to the limits, lack this sort of sovereignty. Yeah. That maybe they're sort of too bound by the sort of morality of custom. Yeah. I don't know. But there's a sort of interpretive question mark as to what to make of this idea of the sovereign individual. Okay, I've got to run because I've got my next class. So I will see you next week. Ciao. Bye-bye.